We are going to be talking about DFI transparency, talking a little bit about some efforts to help make DFIs more transparent, some of the work DFIs are doing themselves to become more transparent, why it's important. And joining me for this conversation, I have Gary Forster, who's the CEO of Publish What You Fund, Duncan Hames, who's the head of policy at Transparency International, and joining us from Washington, D.C. is Bethany Brez. Bethany, it's good to see you with us virtually here today. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
So I think to kick off this conversation, I want to go to you first, Gary. Publish What You Fund worked on this DFI transparency initiative over a number of years and came out of it with the DFI transparency tool. So you did a lot of data and research. You worked with the DFIs and with civil society and to really identify some of the key challenges around DFI transparency, and then to create this set of tools to help DFIs improve. So tell us a little bit about that work. Where are DFIs in terms of transparency? What is the tool?
Sure, thank you. And really looking forward to this conversation. Delighted we could be here today. So yeah, the DFI Transparency Initiative that you mentioned is a Gates-funded program. We started it about 3 years ago. We've been working collaboratively with, as you mentioned, with DFIs, with their shareholders, with civil society, with the private sector, with think tanks, with a whole range of people. And we started the program by doing a kind of a landscape analysis across what are the key areas of interest for people when they're looking at development finance institutions. So we looked at impact, we looked at ESG and accountability, we looked at the financial aspects of investments. And all throughout, we would bring together stakeholders and experts in these areas. And what we tried to identify was what are the key information needs that individuals have, what are DFIs able to provide, and what's something that's often cited when it comes to development finance institutions being transparent. We did some sort of research into that to see what are the limitations, what could we really be legitimately asking for from these institutions. That work then led to the production of the DFI Transparency Tool, which is a kind of a list of fields of information and documents that we expect DFIs to provide either at an organizational kind of policy level or at an individual investment level. And what we're doing with that tool, and it's very granular, because I should say that the DFI Transparency Initiative was launched because there was a recognition that while we had lots of policies and principles around transparency, there wasn't anywhere that actually stipulated this is the specific information we want to see for every single investment. So the tool is very granular, and we are now in the process of evaluating 27 DFIs, many of whom we've been working with very closely, looking at their sovereign and non-sovereign portfolios against the fields laid out in the tool. And we're going to produce a ranking in January, actually January the 25th, we're launching it, which will compare the institutions and will demonstrate how transparent these organizations are. Now, let me zoom out for a second and talk about why this matters, right? So there's a whole bunch of questions that we started off with 3 or 4 years ago that I think we still struggle to answer from the majority of the information that DFIs put out. Simple things. How much impact are DFIs making? It's actually a really, really hard question to answer. It's easier for some things like jobs and tax receipts, you might get some insight, but actually when you're looking at information about how an investment might align with the SDGs or contribute to the SDGs, it's just very hard to figure it out. And of course, we're working with a real range of institutions from the big IFC, World Bank, African Development Banks, down to some smaller bilateral organizations. And some of these organizations barely have a website, barely update the projects. So there's a real range of transparency, but fundamentally it's pretty difficult to answer a simple question like what is the impact? Questions like how much are DFIs mobilizing? Okay, how much private finance are they mobilizing? We can't tell. We can't tell on an investment level. We can't tell if actually it's other DFI money that's being mobilized. We can't tell if it's maybe the investee collateral that's being counted. Are DFIs crowding in or crowding out other forms of finance? You know, DFIs are huge, and when you take them as a group, you're talking beyond $1 trillion in assets under management. You know, they have the potential to distort markets. If DFIs are really crowding in finance, where is that happening? What's working well? How can we learn from that? There are instances where we get private investors coming to us saying, hey, have you seen this deal? It's way below market rate. We could definitely have offered this finance, but the DFIs have come in and taken it. Are DFIs consulting with local stakeholders, even on their highest risk investments? There's very little transparency around whether that's happening. How much risk is being taken, and what are the returns, and how can private investors learn from that so they might be enticed into these markets? And how many investments the DFI is actually originating versus how many might be repeat investments in a specific space, which arguably could be supported by private financiers. So that's just an insight into some of the why. And again, all DFIs are different. I recognize we've got Bethany from USDFC, who have engaged a lot on this project, putting a lot of work in to be more transparent. But it's for a lot of the institutions, it's not so easy to see what's going on. We've talked this morning about getting more resources. I mean, the truth is that DFIs are getting more money than ever before. I mean, the British International Investment, BII, it's in the current UK government strategy that they'll receive more capital. I mean, obviously, we've just had a new Prime Minister and things might change. But, you know, they have received capital in the last few years. Proparco in France, much of France's GNI increase in ODA has gone to Proparco, which is their bilateral DFI. So, and the MDBs are talking about changing their approach to risk to be able to mobilize more capital. So these institutions are going to get lots more money. We need to be able to better understand what their contribution is to the SDGs and to impact and to everything. Now, in terms of who needs this information, it's not just us meddling NGOs and think tanks that want all of this data and all these investments. The private sector has been crying out for this. They need this information of what investments are happening, where, how are they structured, what are the returns, what is the risk, so that they can bring more finance to bear. Affected communities not just need but deserve, have a right, should be able to be provided with this information. Shareholders of these DFIs we speak to frequently, they don't always have the information they'd like to understand if the institutions are doing what they're doing, and DFIs themselves need to learn from one another. So in terms of, to kind of finish, you know, we'll be producing this ranking, this DFI Transparency Index on January 25th. I can't tell you right now who's going to come top and bottom and so on. Overall, we are not where we need to be. Now, that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, firstly because you've just heard me do that speech, but secondly because every single report in the development finance space for the last 10, 15 years has said we need more transparency on what's going on. What I can say is the biggest areas of concern are around mobilization, around impact, and around accountability to communities. That's where we're seeing the least or the most poor quality data, and that really worries us. Of course, what we never know is, does that data actually exist in the first place? You know, and it's just being held in systems that we don't see publicly, or you know, or is it not there, which would be concerning. But I'll finish on kind of a positive note, okay? DFIs are part of everything. You can't talk about climate, you can't talk about women's economic empowerment, you can't talk about lots and lots of issues, rebuilding Ukraine. You can't talk about these things without recognizing that development finance institutions will play a role in one way or another, either directly or through their lending to governments, through their lending through financial intermediaries. But through this process, these 3 years of work that we've done, collaborating with DFIs, we have seen genuine change. We have seen a real effort by a number of players, not all of them, not all the multilaterals, not all the bilaterals, but some have really come to the table. They understand the importance of being able to demonstrate their contribution. They're changing their systems, they're changing their reporting. You know, it is quite complex for a large institution to change its practices to be able to make this information available. There's also legal issues where maybe we have to change the way that contracts are written in order to make sure that investees are happy with information being shared. So we're not going to get this overnight. But we're very confident that when we report in January, yes, we won't be where we want to be, but we'll be a lot better than where we were 12 months ago. We really need to keep up this momentum, and we look forward to working with the development finance institutions and other actors to push greater transparency.
Well, I think that tees up going to Bethany here in a second, but one of the things you talked about is the research you did on commercial confidentiality. And I think one of the things that was interesting in what you found is that often the investees of DFIs were actually willing to provide more information than they were either being asked for or was being reported publicly. And so I think that's a really interesting thing that came out of that work, and something to think about. Now, maybe, like you said, you need different legal structures so DFIs can disclose some of that. But you know, I think there was sometimes a desire to hide behind a commercial confidentiality argument, and that showed that perhaps there's more leeway. Certainly, commercial confidentiality will limit some data. But I think that was a particularly interesting thing to come out of the work that you did. Bethany, I want to go to you because you have been helping the U.S. Development Finance Corporation sort of make progress on transparency using this tool. So tell us a little bit about what has that work looked like in the past year? What are you doing? What have you sort of targeted to do first? And then what's coming up?
Well, first, thank you for having me. And I do want to thank Gary and the Publish What You Fund team, because one of the things that's been very useful for DFC is when we engaged in the creation of the tool, and now that we've been engaging as Publish What You Fund has been assessing DFC and other DFIs, is that this really is providing a roadmap for DFIs on what transparency and accountability should look like. And so, as was mentioned, there's things that we are already doing, both DFC and other DFIs, and there are things that we need to be working on to get there, to raise our transparency, to be accountable to ourselves, to governments, to our stakeholders, to clients, and to those affected communities that we work in. So DFC is committed to data transparency and accountability. And while that is external facing in terms of the information that we are putting out there, making available and making accessible, one of the things that we have actively worked on in the last year, and that has actually borne fruit for us, is focusing internally. So we have created a cross-agency data working group. This group has looked at a host of data issues for DFC. But the reason that we have done this is to increase data governance, to have a data strategy at DFC, which will all lead to our increased ability to be transparent and accountable. So building a data culture is something that has been very important to us and something that we're actively working on. And what does this start with? So it started with some of the low-hanging fruit. So some of the things that we've already been able to do, again, engaging and using the tool as a roadmap, has been putting more information on DFC's approach to impact on our website. So now we have a very comprehensive page on how DFC is measuring and monitoring and managing impact. This includes our impact quotient, which is our performance management tool to evaluate the potential development impact of every project and measure this over time. We also have grown our robust impact management team in order to be working on our impact quotient, but also impact theses. And so we've also published sectoral impact theses on our website, which links our work to a theory of change, and also, as mentioned before on the SDGs, shows how DFC's work is advancing progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We have also published information. We have a comprehensive database on our active projects, which includes investment financial information. It includes development impact information, information on environmental impacts and social protection. So this is information that we already have out there and accessible to our stakeholders. But we know that we can do better. And so for us, this has just been a start. And so one of the things that we've worked on using the tool as a guide is stepping back and looking at sectoral and initiative definitions at DFC. Do we have a good understanding of how we are defining these things so that we can make sure that we have the data to communicate what we're actively doing by sector, by initiative, across our entire portfolio, by region? So we really wanted to make sure that we had a good understanding across DFC of what this means. We're also actively working on a transparency and disclosure policy, which is something that we've engaged with Publish What You Fund on, and looking, again, learning from peers, from peer DFIs who have these robust and established policies. And so that's something, again, that's not an immediate, something immediately that we can achieve, but we are actively working on it. And that, again, that was hugely impacted by the transparency tool. One of the things in terms of the active project information, while we have it on our website, we're looking to create more easily downloadable spreadsheets of this information on our website. So right now we have it in an active database, and we want to make something so that's more accessible for people to use this data.
Well, I would probably speak for a lot of people to say that would be great. At Devex, we've just done an analysis of a bunch of data on bilateral DFIs, and I will say that there's a lot of progress that could be made on making that data more easily accessible so that a wide variety of folks can actually use it and look at it to evaluate things rather than, copy paste every single PDF document into a separate form. Duncan, I want to bring you into this conversation, and Bethany, we'll come back to you and hear a bit more about what DFC is doing and what some of the challenges are on this work as well. So Transparency International released a report earlier this year, sort of a guide for investors to better integrate anti-corruption work into their investments. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that research and what you're sort of identifying as the gaps in transparency on these sort of corruption standards and the work that you're doing with DFIs in this space.
Yes, thank you. And it's really exciting to hear about what DFC and Publish What You Fund have been collaborating on, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results on that. The work that we did, which was supported by British International Investment, I guess approached it from the other end and is complementary. We're Transparency by name, but at heart we're an anti-corruption campaign, and we were looking, as you say, at how a focus on business integrity can help impact investors realize their objectives. And I think the most important conclusion that we reached from that research was that doing business with integrity needs to be seen as central to any developmental mandate. And that mindset affects the kind of information you want to gather and share and disclose. Absolutely, a failure to manage corruption risks, counter fraud, sanctions issues, a wide range of business integrity concerns risks undermining the positive social, environmental, and developmental objectives that you have. But that's not the only way of looking at it. We think that there are huge opportunities for positive developmental impact from programmatically addressing corruption itself. There's a case study in our report which comes from research cited in the Harvard Business Review about a digital payments company in Nigeria, backed by impact investors, that did work with the Ministry of Agriculture in Nigeria and managed to redirect 90% of the value of a seeds and fertilizer subsidy that had been lost to mismanagement and corruption back to the farmers, who themselves were able to achieve greater maize yields as a result. Now, those kind of results don't come from seeing corruption and these business integrity issues as compliance issues. Those kind of results come from seeing them as an opportunity by which you can achieve your social and environmental objectives.
Yeah, I think this sort of brings up this question of, and Gary, you touched on it a little bit, but why is transparency important, right? So do you do transparency just because transparency is a good thing? But I think that it's deeper than that, and I think that gets at that, right? There's a business opportunity in some of this work. There's, and Gary, you touched on this, but I hear it too a lot from the private sector. We're trying to deploy capital into these areas, but we don't have access to this wealth of information where you've proven a business case against something. So I'm curious sort of how you think about why transparency is important and why it's important perhaps for different audiences as well. And Bethany, maybe I'll come to you first. Why? Because this is one, some of it can be hard work. You're rethinking data systems in a government agency, being more transparent, could open you up to additional criticism. So why does DFC engage on this work in this way? And how do you see it as also potentially benefiting DFC? Are there ways that you can then incorporate this data in helping projects achieve a greater development impact than they might be on track to do, or spending your money more effectively? So tell me a little bit about why DFC is engaged in this work and sort of how you would answer this question about why it's important.
Well, I think you touched on some of the reasons important on development impact and appropriate use of financial resources and learning. But what it comes down to is this is good practice. This is something we should be doing. We should be willing to say, this is what we're investing in. This is the impact of our investments. This is how much we're spending. This is where. This is what we're working on. This is what we're trying to achieve. This is what we did achieve. So I think it's just good practice, and it's part of good business. Now, for DFC, I think the advantage is that we also learn a lot about our investments. Our peers learn a lot. We have engaged with DFIs on a lot of peer learning on a variety of different topics. And I think this is one of the things that helps with that. Can we do business better? Can we learn from what we've done? And when we think we're having a potential development impact, or we assess that this is the development impact potential of a certain project, and then when we look at the actual results, we can see, how could we have better structured the project with the client to have more impact? And the last thing I'll say is that we have done a performance evaluation of our financial intermediaries portfolio in Latin America. And again, that was really an opportunity for us to see this data, to learn from it. And we've put that on our website so others can learn as well. So I think it's important because it's good practice, but it's also an opportunity for learning and, to better structure your investments, to have more impact and better use your resources.
And my understanding is that sort of based on the findings of that report on sort of how your financial intermediaries are investing, the investments that you're making in them, you're actually have issued a grant to a consortium that's going to help train those financial intermediaries to do that work better. I wonder if there's anything you can tell us sort of about that, or how you're using sort of that data to then say, hey, maybe we're not having the full impact that we wanted to have with those investments.
Right. So I think, that is why we are doing these types of portfolio evaluations, because we're going back and saying, okay, how can we use this information, and what do we need to do? Who do we need to partner with? How can we do things differently? I think in this case, it's taking some of that additional support, so that when we are looking at such a deal, we are looking at structuring it a little bit differently, or again, taking into account, looking at the context and how we can make sure that the use of financial intermediaries is as strong as it can be, and that we also are able to really assess the impact of those types of deals. And I think one of the other things is this is just the start of these types of evaluations, this type of learning, and then feeding it back in to the structure of the projects we're doing. So we're really looking forward to doing this on other topics. And financial intermediaries was the first. So it was really great to be able to see the use of this information, to get the support to use the information, and now putting it actually into practice.
Well, Gary, the financial intermediaries were actually a big part of the research you did, because it's part of the lending that, one, a lot of DFIs do a lot of lending through financial intermediaries, and it's quite opaque, much more so than a lot of their direct investments. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about where you think the challenges are with financial intermediaries and what DFIs could or should be reporting.
Sure. So if anyone's not familiar with financial intermediaries, these could be private equity firms, they could be banks. They play a very important role in the financial landscape and allow DFIs to put capital into them, and then to have that distributed often for things like mortgage finance or SME finance across tens, hundreds, thousands, potentially millions of individuals in a country. So they play that important role of getting down to the grassroots in a way that maybe a DFI couldn't. Historically, the research shows, and this kind of research predates our work, but it shows that, one, they're not particularly transparent because the financial intermediaries are maybe not put under pressure to provide that information or don't have the system set up to provide that information. And again, we're not looking for the detail, the name of every person who set up an SME under a loan from the IFC to a bank. We're kind of still looking for that. What was the overall impact? What was the overall investment like? Not only are they less transparent, but the other problem is increasingly there have been problems with them being, in some cases, high risk and leading to problems on the project or affecting communities. And then because there's a financial intermediary between the source of the funds, which is a DFI, and the community, it can be really hard to trace back and get recourse for communities if something goes wrong. And in the worst cases, things can go really wrong on these investments, and you need to be able to trace that back. We have a whole section in the transparency tool about financial intermediary investments. I'm not going to go into the detail now because I'll quickly run out of intellectual rope. But we are seeking to push forward the amount of transparency we get on those financial intermediary deals, and the DFIs that are working with us on that seem to welcome that, because I think they're saying, a bit like Bethany was saying, this kind of internal efficiency argument for transparency, I don't think we make it enough, but it constantly comes up. We had Gavi over the summer, the vaccine initiative that we were working with, wrote a piece about how much more they know about what they're doing because they've got their systems in order to be transparent in the way that we encourage them to be. The same with the Foreign Commonwealth Office before it merged with DFID, did a huge piece of work with them, and they said the same, that to be transparent means you have to have your internal systems and everything aligned. You learn an awful lot more about what you're doing.
Yeah. Duncan, did you want to jump in?
Well, I wonder whether I might take this opportunity to address one of the recommendations in our report, which relates to beneficial ownership transparency. We know that secretive offshore jurisdictions are widely used as a means of shielding and hiding the identity of beneficiaries of companies. And without saying that you can't use these jurisdictions, your intermediaries can't use these jurisdictions, we do recommend that any of these investment channels should, at least wherever the partners are based, adhere to the highest of local or OECD standards around transparency in this respect. And I think it's an important measure to take if one really wants to have assurance about who is benefiting from these endeavours.
So I want to go back to something that we talked a little bit about, which is commercial confidentiality. And Bethany, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that and how does DFC intend to ask investees for more data, to publish more of that data? How are you sort of navigating that based on some of the findings, based on some of the recommendations that have come through the tool? I imagine that's perhaps one of the more challenging pieces of this transparency. You talked about sort of going after the low-hanging fruit first. So how do you go after the harder, thornier issues, including potentially more data that comes right up to the line of commercial confidentiality?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely something that we've discussed. It's something that is not unique to DFC, and other DFIs are thinking about this and looking at how what more they can do on collection of data and then publication of data. We're actively talking about this. I mean, this is why we're trying to improve our internal capacity and improve our technological systems, because we also want to make sure that if we are going to be asking more, that we're using that information, that we have the ability to use that information, and that we need that information. So we're working on it with our impact management teams, with our general counsel teams, with our deal teams. And so it's something that we want to do more in, but it is one of those, I think, longer term projects or activities that is, again, helped to be motivated by the transparency tool. So, and it's also something I think that, we are engaging in learning with other DFIs on. We know the importance of this information. We know the importance of client confidentiality, and there's a balance there. And so we want to make sure that we are balancing those appropriately, but then collecting and putting out as much data as we can for accountability and to communicate to stakeholders.
Right. I guess one question I would have is, I think, one sort of concern is, one, a lot of these DFIs have different sort of reporting requirements for their investees. And certainly if you're talking about smaller investees, perhaps in the lowest income markets where a lot of DFIs are sort of being pushed to shift their focus, talking about that sort of data burden on the investees, I think, is an important piece of this, because transparency is important, but do you make it impossible for them to access the capital? So I guess my question is, how do you right-size that information? Are there things that the DFIs can be doing better to coordinate on what they're asking? So it's not, because, I mean, one of the things that I was speaking to Soren Andreessen, who leads EDFI, the Association of European DFIs, and he was saying that something like 50% of the bilateral European DFIs, 50% of their projects are co-financed with other bilateral European DFIs. So we're seeing a lot of DFIs in on the same deals, which we knew, that just puts a number on it. And so, but often, people are having to report different information and different, so I wonder if you think we need some more standardization and how you sort of right-size that, right? So how do you not, by requiring so much more reporting, sort of price out smaller local actors?
So our sense, so do we need more standardization? So there has been a lot of standardization, specifically in the impact space. Of course, we have harmonized indicators and so on. What we're not seeing is that information then funnel through to publicly available data. And I think one of our arguments a couple of years ago, still valid now, is we need to get that balance right. We can't just have harmonization behind closed doors where everyone agrees they're using a certain set of indicators, but no one ever sees the results. And look, I mean, Bethany will attest to this. All of the DFIs are constantly talking about, are there ways that we can harmonize on pretty much everything, because they recognize that either they're co-financing, or just to be fair to investees, that it makes sense. I've forgotten the second part of your question, but Duncan's got an answer for me.
Well, I just wanted to chip in. I think there are a number of secondary benefits to harmonization here. So firstly, it supports a culture of the sort that Bethany was describing, of peer learning and exchange. It also, as you point out, recognizes that we need to have a proportionate burden on investees. We want to take advantage of the willingness that Gary described to provide information by having a collaborative culture around this exchange of information and disclosure between investees and investors. And that will be supported by recognizing those benefits. But I think also most exciting of all, if you've got this kind of harmonized approach to questions such as business integrity, it's very facilitative of collective action interventions by DFIs in a particular market or geography. And that creates all sorts of further opportunities for greater impact. So it's not just a kind of efficiency question. It actually is enabling of much greater ambition.
Bethany, do you want to chime in on that, how you're sort of thinking about what data? I know that you guys are doing a lot of thinking through what are sort of the impact data that you're asking, and I think it was very valid that you're saying we don't want to gather data that we can't use at this point in a practical way.
Yes, and these are active conversations. Again, you mentioned the statistic on how many deals are co-financed, and it's something where we want to be doing work with the other DFIs on what information we're collecting. There's a lot of harmonization work around impact measurement. We know there's a lot around environmental and social issues with the IFC performance standards. So I think there is precedent on this. With everything, though, we are all, especially the bilateral DFIs, coming from different governments. And so, there will be some information that we may need or collect that others don't, and vice versa. But on the information that we all know we need, it is something where we're actively, looking at how can we make sure we're collectively addressing these issues. And as was mentioned, to reduce the burden on clients, but then also it enables us to look across DFIs on certain impact metrics, for example. And so we can see how we're all doing. I think it also enables us to do more. And that's really important. We know that in infrastructure alone, the investment needs are really great and are calling for collective action by DFIs and DBs in order to, address the infrastructure investment financing gap. So we need to be able to do more. We need to do it well. And so, by doing things in alignment as much as we can and as allows, that's going to help enable that.
Great. I want to turn to the audience and see if you have some questions for our panelists. All right. First hand I saw is here.
Hi, this is Tasha. I'm from Population Services International. And I've heard a lot on this panel about kind of who this tool and greater transparency could benefit. But somebody that hasn't been mentioned is governments. And I think it's a major concern right now is that governments don't have insight into the level of funding being spent in their country. So to kind of get at what I'm trying to say, PEPFAR, for example, oftentimes funds almost 200% of a country's health budget. And then when you layer on Global Fund, all of a sudden you're at 300%. And then when you layer on the President's Malaria Initiative, you're at 400%. And then when you layer on the hundreds and hundreds of other investors and philanthropists and donors and governments investing in a country, governments don't have insight into where money is going in their country. How do you see this tool as supporting governments in their transparency into funding, and how might governments use this to identify financing gaps?
Do you want to just pass your mic one row? Perfect.
Hi, Andrew Murray Watson from British International Investment. I know, Gary, we've been deeply engaged with your report for the last couple of years, so and thank you for that. And I think we can all agree that greater transparency is fundamentally a good thing. The question I have is there's obviously a massive funding gap right now in terms of meeting the SDGs and infrastructure demands just in an African context. Is there a danger, therefore, that you set the reporting bars so high that it becomes an impediment to those capital flows that are so badly needed? And I guess a sort of related question is, to what extent is there a danger that you end up having 7 people steering the boat and only 1 person actually doing the rowing?
We'll go here. We'll take, yeah, if you want to pass it down. Perfect.
Good afternoon. My name is Gavin McGillivray. Until last year, I was head of DFI DFCDO in India. And my question is mainly for Gary and Bethany, is the pursuit of greater transparency requiring DFIs to change the way they do business? In India, DFID and then the FCDO, we invested in funds alongside both the Indian government and private investors. And when we came to have those funds evaluated, independently evaluated, the evaluators often found that the confidentiality clauses in the fund management agreements, which were common to all of the investors, us and others, really, well, maybe they hid behind them, or they used them not to disclose the sort of information we wanted. So essentially that will require us going forward to have different contracts with different clauses. And I wonder if you're finding that in real time, Bethany, or Gary, you're sort of making proposals of how this can be done. Thank you.
Great. So we can take those questions. I'll repeat them also because I don't know if you could hear them well, Bethany, so just to make sure you can hear them as well. So maybe we'll start with this last question, which was about whether sort of the pursuit of greater transparency is requiring DFIs to do business differently. for example, to do contracting differently. And so Bethany, maybe we'll go to you with that question first. As you're looking to do this, are you saying then, legally we need to structure our agreements differently? How are the sort of deal teams thinking about that through the investment process?
This is why it was important for us in working on these data transparency and capacity issues to make sure that all of our business offices were involved, and that includes our funds team and our general counsel's office, because this is something that they will be best suited to address and look into and see what's possible for us. I think going back to what I mentioned on the performance evaluation of financial intermediaries in Latin America, I mean, yes, it's helping us to change the way we do business in a better way. Now, the amount of that change, I think, could be small depending on what's needed, or it could be large. But it's something where that's a really good example of helping us to do business better. So, in terms of funds and looking at that, this is something that our general counsel's office and funds team, they're actively looking into right now, again, as part of these data efforts at DFC.
Great. And so the other two questions we had was one, sort of the governments as a beneficiary of transparency efforts so they have a better understanding of what's happening in their countries. And the second question was about whether some of these transparency efforts create too high of a reporting burden, so it becomes an impediment to the much needed capital flows.
Yeah. Should I take the first one?
Yeah.
So on the governments, it's a really important point. And at the moment, so one of the things that the tool does is on a number of the fields of information we're talking about, the tool is aligned to something called the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which is a reporting standard for aid and development finance. And if DFIs put their information in that format, it would be visible to somebody from the, let's say, Nigerian government who wants to go and look at all of the funds coming into Nigeria. They'd see it versus, FCDO versus USAID versus African Development Bank and so on. So we're trying to build that global data set, which has really kind of come of age in the last couple of years. Governments are accessing that data. They're doing it through either aid management platforms in their countries, or they're doing it through new tools that are available. Not all governments, for sure, and there is a certain amount of whether it's working with the governments to raise their awareness of that or improving the tools, I'm not sure, but it's an important point. So we're trying to encourage, I mean, the truth is at the moment, if you were the finance minister in Nigeria and you wanted to know what the top 20 DFIs were doing in your country, some of them don't even have a website where you can select Nigeria. So even just some of the basic stuff we're pushing for, I think should help. Shall I have a stab at the BII one?
Got time?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, so I was going to say, are we going to make the reporting burden too high? We're working across a mixture of DFIs. Some of the bilaterals we work with maybe have 10, 15, 20 investments a year. We're not asking for information that they shouldn't already have. So I would like to think that for a quarter of a person a year, or we could get that information. Whether we're talking about placing too high a burden on investees, I think we do have to be careful of that. But investees have said they'd be willing to give us more information. The thing that really worries me is when we're in conversations with DFIs and they say, if we have to put this level of reporting in our in our investment packs, we're going to lose the deal to another DFI. That's the stuff that really worries me. Like, what is the supply in the market like if, BII loses a deal to whoever because they've asked for some impact data? Let me stop there.
So on this question, I thought Bethany spoke very eloquently at the beginning about what is essentially the demonstration effect. When it comes to business integrity, this has the potential to shape the environment in which your investments are taking place, and so I think there is a double dividend there. I want this conversation to be a collaborative one. I want you to see NGOs like ourselves as being here to help. We're intending to launch a forum for impact investors, and off the back of the work that we've done with British International Investment over the last couple of years, we're looking to go from having set out both the challenge and the opportunities of this issue into being able to produce some practical guidance on identifying and monitoring business investment risks, not just at the point of investment, but throughout the monitoring of an investment portfolio as well. So I hope that rather than just leave one person rowing the boat, that actually we can all work together.
Great. We'll take one. If you have a very, very short question, be the last one.
Hi, this is a short question. Joel Cutton from ID Park, Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Consultancy. My question to the panel is, to what degree have you managed to include new donors like China and Turkey in the process?
So for our review, there will be a box on the page that's going to have the graph ranking all of the institutions. There's going to be a box of institutions we just couldn't even get started with because there's just zero information. You don't want to end up in that box. But the truth is, and there are advocacy efforts to get more information out of those organisations, but there's a bunch that you can't even start because there is just nothing.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us for this conversation. I think it's a good one. I think it's a live one, and something that certainly I will continue to be following in the work that we're doing at Devex. For those of you who are here, we have 2 workshops that are up next. The first workshop is about making NGO impact measurement fit for purpose. It's in partnership with PIND. And the idea is to have a collaborative discussion on solutions and share ideas. It'll be interactive, looking at how the nonprofit sector can sort of seize opportunities presented by development finance and better meet the needs of this quickly evolving impact measurement landscape. That's going to be in the St. Pancras room. It's on this floor. People will be outside helping you find your way there. And the other workshop is going to be a discussion and a sneak preview of an upcoming Devex report that we're going to be releasing about bilateral DFIs, where we have done our best to collect some information. We'll tell you a little bit about what we found today. And even if you don't go to that one, we'll make sure that you guys all get a copy of the report when it's out in a few weeks. That conversation is upstairs in the Battle Bridge room. So go enjoy your workshops and then come back here and join us at the end of that and stick around to the end of the day for the reception as well. Thank you.